Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Ghosthunters of Reddit, what was your scariest experience yet and why?
Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and highlighted it over to the auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he actually might have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline, but the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he honestly believed what he claimed to see, either that, or he was a hell of a salesperson. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigations. He had a delightful album of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll that he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical college kid questions: have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that, and a few that were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone so apparently revered in the field of the supernatural slip away, so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. "Yes, you, the girl in the white shirt?" "Yeah, hi," I said, and I know I sounded nervous, because I felt so dumb for sounding so nervous. "I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter?" I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. "I know I did." "Well," he said, forcing a tight little laugh, "it was forced, I know it was. There are so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work." This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember because it really wasn't very scary. At least, it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions. He didn't look my way again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out the theater exit and headed for my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing. "Hey, kid." He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. "Listen, I'm sorry," I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid little girl. "I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything." He shook his head. He brushed the ashes off the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of strange danger, just like they taught in the intro to university classes, then sat down, keeping a healthy distance between us. He was old, I was young. I could probably outrun the guy. Or who knows, maybe I was just as stupid as I felt. "I didn't tell the truth," the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, the wrinkles deeper. The confident salesperson aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things. "That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career." "I know," I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known I knew. "This is the scariest moment of my career," he said, and this is what he told me. It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached success in the paranormal industry quite yet and was left to pick up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, were children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. CS whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, were children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing there were phantoms after them, were children playing pranks on gullible and concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and off I went. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for. It was the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was that their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had tried to hate his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small, loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a clever idea. I wish I could say the visit itself was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful, remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop, that is, if it were ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating the home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed to be depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off to the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything, that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring the home, I was impressed with how up-to-date it had been. It was clearly from the early 1900s, and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and character of the house was carefully preserved as it was given necessary updates, like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were clammy stones that were prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason and, while it certainly felt very spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with the single hanging light and its vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large, slotted drains set in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen, poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, and so I ignored it. But then it came again, louder this time. There was a steep spiral staircase that led to the 2nd floor, winding up from the corner of the small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping their son off in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just, floating isn't even the right word. Just coming. Coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes. It had no face. And yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. Then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy? Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I appended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted, it was all the hallucinations of an extremely sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing from my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, to run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe the house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by, the accusation still ringing fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us. And eventually, yes, I did. Old newspaper clippings didn't tie the stories together, not necessarily, but I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been the residence of a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home/office space. It was a grand feat of architecture and a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, the bedroom. Mid-level, the funeral home. In the basement, there is a mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all its value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo through my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that morticians felt such an ardent desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in the basement were unspeakable. But yes, I know. I know what he did to them. And it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression, the way all the color dropped out of him as he went on, the white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin. The slump of his shoulders. The way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off. He left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment. But, as I grew up, as campus activities were replaced with bills and my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week, when I moved in with my fiancé. When I took the boxes into the basement, despite his warnings of spiders and mold. Because there's a large, slotted drain in the center of the room. And I'm so worried, so scared, about what I might know.
I was roughly 8 years old living in the hills of Appalachia in Tennessee, near Norris Lake. We had a 2-story house the basement with garage, fireplace/wood storage, utility room with laundry. The second story had the kitchen, living room, 3 bedrooms, and 1 bath. My dad was a single parent working at a metal factory. My sister was 3 years older than me and at a different school. We were the only 3 people living in the house. One day near summertime, she had school, and I didn't. I unfortunately had to stay home by myself. I was in the living room. I just made and ate some microwave food and walked into the living room to watch cartoons. As I lay on the couch, I noticed this, for lack of better description, formless, semi-transparent white thing enters the room from the basement. It moved fast and it was noiseless. It did not interact with anything in the room. I froze and couldn't move. It circled around the ceiling 5 to 6 times before retreating to the back hallway. I told my sister when she came home, but she didn't believe me. I don't remember bringing it up with Dad. That was the only time I've had anything close of an encounter with a ghost. Even then, I still blame my alone child mind. It could have been anything. It wasn't enough of an experience to make me believe. I still don't believe it. I want to, but nothing has given solid proof that they do. I have even been into some pretty interesting places. As a police officer, I was called to an abandoned psychiatric facility. 2 kids were seen going in and never came out. Went inside. All the equipment had been removed and it was just graffiti and vandalized doorways left. Never found those kids, but also never found a ghost. Had a 911 call from an abandoned house once, which happened apparently. No phone line, no power, nothing set up, and the address was correct. Could have been a dispatcher messing with me, but I believe it was just a disturbance in the existing taps to the property. 3. My team was investigating the Burlington County Prison in NJ. Unnerving place. Has a huge painted eye over the door into the cells that says, "We are watching you" over it. Has mannequins in cells. Very weird vibe. We are science and IT and photography types. I battle myself and everyone, despite having had paranormal experiences personally, that it is impossible to capture evidence of these events. I don't think we have any means to adequately measure these experiences in science and think they're purely personally. Anyway, we had everything. Sound recorders everywhere. We had full spectrum cameras. We had an Xbox laser grid that accurately mapped any moving, dense matter in a room in a 3D comp program. We had an ambulance, the Black Betty, that we ran everything into and converted into a home base. Pretty cool stuff. Anyway, we spent hours investigating the location and there was nothing. No experience. It was dead. So, we decided to pack up. We are split up. I'm on the first floor with another member. 2 members are on the middle floor. And another member is going into the basement to turn on the lights. We collect everything before we turn the lights on. Right as I turn off the last audio recorder, my friend gives the okay to switch on the power. Right as the lights go on, and we no longer have any recording or listening abilities, we hear a massive, earth-shaking crash. This place is a museum. Huge cases filled with objects from when the prison was active. This crash shook the floor. It sounded like a huge display case was pushed over and smashed. I could feel it in the ground below me. I could hear glass smashing and scattering across the ground. I could feel the physics of it all. The sound of broken objects filled the whole prison. It came from below us. Someone just broke something really expensive. We are never going to get to come back here. As we went down, the 2 people on the middle floor were rushing up. What happened up there? Nothing. What did you do? They couldn't understand why we thought it came from the middle floor. But that is where we heard and felt it. They heard and felt it come from our floor. They searched our floor, we searched their floor. The guy in the basement came upstairs in a rush, having heard the massive crash come from the middle like us. For whatever reason, we all felt this happen on different floors. We all were certain we heard/felt the crash from the floor below/above us. We looked everywhere. There was nothing. Not a broken case. Glass. Window. Nothing outside. I searched for an additional hour just because I couldn't imagine something that massive sounding, that physical, just not leaving a trace. Really broke my brain. I cannot for the life of me understand how this happened. And left no evidence. I personally think prison was weird with us. Because right before this happened, when we were finalizing the investigation and saying things like, if you have something to say, now is your chance. We are going to leave soon. I joked to everyone and said, watch. Once we shut everything off, something crazy will happen. Well, I was right. It was utterly perplexing. The park rangers came in and looked too. Found nothing. They called a week later to confirm nothing was broken. WTF. For one time a few friends and I were camping out overnight in a local campground and started telling scary stories. It was like 3 a.m. and we were pretty tired, so as we were about to go to bed, but out of nowhere the crows started cawing like crazy for 10 minutes and we had no idea what was going on. We decided to try moving our tent to a different location, but the noise seemed to be everywhere. Eventually, we just said whatever and tried to go to sleep. The noise quieted down, but then around 4 a.m. I heard this really strange whisper in my ear. I assumed it was one of my friends, but everyone looked asleep. I saw that our tent entrance was unzipped, and when I went to close it I looked out and just saw this slightly glowing figure way out in the distance above the lake. I swear it was like some lady in a wedding dress, but I barely got a look. I was so terrified that I just zipped up the tent as fast as possible and went to back bed. It sounds pretty vanilla, but I am so scared to look out of a window or something in the middle of the night and just see her again hovering all still like. 5. I'm not necessarily a ghost hunter, but I do enjoy urban exploring and venturing into the unknown, if you will. This particular story happened around 5 years ago or so. I still can't explain it. My friends and I were being dumb and reckless as we were around the age of 16. We decided it would be fun to grab a Ouija board and go to one of our favorite abandoned places. This abandoned place was an old insane asylum that we used to break into every weekend for the adrenaline rush. This asylum was 2 stories high, it was old and falling apart. There were also always rumors floating around our small town that it was extremely haunted. Anyway, we got in and sat down in the middle of the building on the 2nd floor. We began goofing off and moving the planchette trying to be funny. In short, nothing immediately happened, and we all just began pranking each other and laughing our assessments off. After it was all said and done, we foolishly got into our vehicles and drove home for the night. This is where it gets scary. This story is quite long, so I'll leave out some minor details. On my way home I felt very fatigued and just worn out. Nothing new. I was a kid and I stayed out all night. Of course, I'd be tired, right? Well, for the next month I experienced very bizarre things that even I have a tough time believing. I would wake up most nights with scratches and bruises. The most prominent being a black bruise located on the back of my left upper arm. It was about the size of a baseball. Now I had zero recollection of how this might have occurred, and I was baffled. But I shrugged it off. I then began to notice very odd patterns and omens. 3 times during this month I witnessed 3 owls fly directly at my car and disappear before impact. It scared me so bad I'd jump and lose my breath. There were also times where I'd constantly feel watched and followed. I felt like my privacy was completely invaded. I began to stay up all night because I grew afraid. I felt like I was going crazy. My friends didn't believe me at first until they started noticing that odd things would happen when I was around. Things would go missing then reappear, random animals would act aggressive around me, and my friends even began developing scratches and bruises they couldn't explain either. At this point it was near the end of the month and I was entering a depression as I felt my feelings were very misunderstood. I finally found one girl who believed me and thought that I may have been hexed. Because I was young and dumb, I really didn't understand what this meant or even if it was right. I was miserable for so long, and just a few days after speaking with this woman everything changed. I don't know what happened, but the energy was lighter, and I felt that everything was normal again. I never woke up with scratches or bruises again, and although I see an occasional shadow figure every now and again, I can tell that whatever was happening to me had stopped. I'm 21 now and still very puzzled by my experience, and I would love some additional insight. 6. Not a ghost hunter, but me and my friend were, and still are, hardcore believers. Well, in our early 20s we used to smoke pot and then play hide-and-seek in houses under construction. It was actually tons of fun, pitch black, lots of places to hide and move around. Highly recommend, except I don't suggest doing what me and my friend did. But hey, you do you. One night we are done playing and start smoking another joint. It was 4 of our good friends, my said friend, and myself. Me and my friend convinced everyone to make a quijada board since there was scrap wood and a permanent marker at this one table that the workers used. There were random papers and empty coffee cups and a water bottle. Well, we started asking questions to the quijada board, but no one took it seriously and we were just messing around. Everyone got bored pretty quick and went up to the street to smoke a dart. Me and my friend stuck behind to do it seriously. I don't remember what we said, but we were incredibly open and inviting. We apologized for our friends not being serious and we expressed our desire to make contact very sincerely. It was like 5 sentences at least. Then we asked if anything is there, made yourself known. Then, immediately after, 3, loud as all hell, bangs, louder than I have ever heard, all rang out from around us. They were uniform and spread out over 3 to 4 seconds. Bang. 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 The sound seemed to be coming from inside the room we were in, which was the garage, which had a concrete floor and stucco walls. So, it echoed like no other. But it didn't have a garage door. I have never experienced true fear like this, like a deep feeling that just twisted my gut and jumped up my throat, hair on the back of my neck stood up, chills, and I felt cold. We looked up at each other, we both saw the legitimate ball-shrinking fear in each other's faces. We both knew neither of us was messing around. We moved the tile to goodbye and ran out of the garage like 2 bats fleeing hell. We cheesed it up the steep-ass driveway to our friends who were almost done their cigarettes. All 4 of them were present. All 4 of them smoking, and not one of them out of breath. There was no way anyone else was in that house since we had just played hide and seek in it for like 2 hours. We asked our friends if they heard any loud noises from the house. They didn't hear a goddamn thing. There was no way they wouldn't have heard what essentially gunshots were. They asked us why. We didn't really tell them anything because we knew they wouldn't believe us. And I knew if we told them they'd be like, let's go back and check it out. Hello. No. We left immediately. For the rest of my life, I won't ever be in the same room as people playing kavaya or messing around with spells or pentagrams. I want nothing to do with that stuff. Whatever it was that made those noises that night was angry, and I never wanted to feel that anger. Writing this gave me chills and hair standing on my neck again. I won't ever forget that night. I don't need to believe it. I know. 7. Not ghost hunter. Not quite me either. I have worked doing installations in churches for 13 years. I went to meet my already working co-workers in an old sanctuary. They were freaked out when I got there and asked if I heard anything, which I did. There was some knocking and creaking above behind the stage. Turns out there were some closets and attic rooms we were planning to utilize for some equipment. My coworker went up to a room inside an attic. A broom was in his way leaning against a door. So, he moved it aside against a wall. He went in, surveyed the area, then went to leave. The broom was in his way, standing on its bristles. He hit it aside and left. There was no one else in the church at all, just us. We later found a handwritten cardboard sign in an unreachable place inside an underground air vent saying something about a friend dying, so that may have been unrelated but still added to the abnormality a bit. There was another story, but it didn't involve me at all, so I'll leave it out. 8. Not a ghost hunter remotely, but me and a few mates used to go down to an abandoned mental institution. We used to set up scenarios where we would hide and either make sounds or noises to freak the other person out. Making crying baby noises, ghost sounds, etc. One time we all went to the old nursing quarters. It was usually trashed windows boarded up with corrugated iron, broken glass, cupboards, and everything all broken up was the cupboards. This time it looked like someone had either gone nuts with red paint or... But there was pentagon stuff everywhere, symbols on the ground. I totally thought some kids had been stupid, etc., just mucking around. We split up and I went up the stairs with another friend. Found a mutilated rabbit, and as we passed by a window I heard in tap on the boarded up corrugated iron window. I laughed and tapped back on it. Tap tip tap, shave a haircut, and the other side tapped in response twice. My friend done the same thing, tap tip tap, other side tap. We laughed assuming our other mates were doing that. Went downstairs once done and went outside to find our friends. They weren't there, they came out from inside a few minutes later. I said, "Nice one, the window tapping, who climbed up there?" "Climbed up where?" I went outside and pointed to the window assuming to see a large ledge to support someone. Nope, no ledge and no way someone could have remotely climbed up there. No open windows nearby and our friends were downstairs and nowhere near that. Cold chills, and both me and my mate knew something was tapping on the window. At least it was friendly. 9. Not a ghost hunter but a believer. We had a friendly ghost in the house I grew up in. My dad had this stereo system for years before moving to this house and it always worked fine. But depending on the song, my dad would remember what genres. The ghost would either completely turn off the stereo or he would crank the volume up as loud as he could, and someone would come running into the living room yelling at him to knock it off while they turned it back down. My dad eventually got rid of the stereo. Our favorite things would go missing a lot. Like my brother's favorite shirt went missing when he was like 12 and it was some t-shirt from his first concert, so he always remembered it. It turned up at the top of his shirt drawer the day before he moved out for college. Obviously not the right size anymore, so my mom wouldn't have folded it and put it there by accident. She had no idea it had been found. This sort of thing happened a lot, and me and my two siblings used to play pranks on each other, and it seemed like whoever the prankster was at the time, they had something disappear next. But it would always turn back up eventually. Also, every time it was going to storm, the living room door would slam shut really hard. The living room used to be the door to the outside patio, but it got built around and turned into a living room. And the windows were replaced and stuff because my dad thought it was like a draft. Nothing ever made it stop. If it were going to thunder and pour, our living room door would slam shut like 10 minutes before it started. The guy who built the house was like an ex-military and a survivalist. He died in that house a year before we bought it. The realtor told us if we went digging we might find some cool stuff hidden on the property, but my dad never did. 10. I've had multiple paranormal experiences throughout my life, which isn't uncommon for members of my family. My mom's side of the family is like a magnet for weird stuff, which I apparently inherited. Because of this, I was interested in the paranormal from an exceedingly early age, and by the time I was in my early 20s I was running a small, amateur paranormal investigation group in my town. We investigated a couple homes and businesses, and though we had some interesting results, there really wasn't anything mind-blowing. Now, at that point in my life, despite everything I'd experienced, I'd never actually seen a full-body apparition, but that changed one night. There was a local cemetery that had a decent amount of activity for some reason, and we used it as a place to test new gear and see how potential new members to the group would react to potential phenomena. The interesting thing about this cemetery was that we would get pretty consistent temperature fluctuations, EMF readings, some EVPs, etc., but any time we pulled a camera out, everything just sort of stopped. It was frustrating, but it was what it was. Anyway, we were out at this cemetery one night, just asking questions, checking temperatures, and the like, when it happened. I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye and glanced over to the old two-track that ran along the back edge of the cemetery, and I saw it, a tall, heavy-set man wearing a white shirt and blue overalls, emitting a bluish light as he walked along the two-track. Unfortunately, I didn't see my face/head because of a low-hanging pine branch, but I saw enough. Now, I had experienced things, as I said, and seen things that were incredible, and I had always just assumed that if I saw a full-body apparition, it would be this amazing, exciting thing, but I was not prepared for how my body actually reacted. I felt my legs lose all their strength and almost fell over. My stomach twisted and I thought I was going to be sick. I bent over, dizzy, my mind and body completely thrown for a loop. I can't describe the feeling accurately, but when you see something that shouldn't exist, and it's right there, there is no way to ever be prepared for it. The human mind is never ready to experience something like that. I saw that same apparition one more time in that cemetery, doing the same thing, walking along that back two-track, but it's been years since I've seen it now. I will absolutely never forget it though. I have some other pretty interesting stories, don't investigate anymore as most of my team moved on, so if anyone's interested in hearing them hit me up I guess. 11. I'm not a ghost hunter or professional, but I've had a few paranormal experiences. The first was when I was a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old. I was lying in bed after just waking up. A glowing figure with blue pants and a red shirt walked in through my bedroom window and out the closed door. I froze in absolute panic for a minute and then rushed to open the door it went through. There was nothing there. I told my mom, my friends, and no one believed me. I knew it was real. In my 20s I worked in a coffee shop in Chinatown in my city, which is known for being a city with a lot of ghost stories. Victoria, BC, Canada. Weird things would happen in this shop that were unexplainable. Dishes would frequently fly off the shelf on their own. There would be places in the shop that had an extraordinarily strong smell of old perfume, and when you would go to show someone it would vanish. The radio would get stuck on stations and not be able to be turned off unless you unplugged it. I remember one day I put it at the 80s station. The girl I was working with told me to change it. I couldn't turn it off, the volume up or down, couldn't change the station. I said sorry, not sure what I can do. I'm off at 12 p.m., so I'll unplug it if it isn't working by then. At exactly 12 p.m. the radio, by itself, went through a bunch of different channels amazingly fast and then turned itself off. I had customers frequently tell me they felt the shop was haunted or that they think they saw a ghost. It would always be in the same location, walking through a brick pillar wall in the middle of the shop. One day I did see the ghost myself. I was very hungover working on a quiet Sunday morning with my coworker. I remember I was reading a fictional book on time travel, and it was blowing my mind. I knew the shop was haunted because I could feel the energy, and with all of the strange things going on. I had the feeling the ghost wanted to show itself to me, but I always resisted it for being too afraid. My coworker and I decided to sit down in the shop and have a coffee together since there were no customers. We were sitting and chatting when I saw a glowing white figure of a man walk slowly through that same brick wall. I was absolutely terrified. When my coworker turned around to see what I was in panic about, it was gone. I questioned myself over and over about it, but it was definitely real. I was in a very weird mental state for a week after the incident because it shook my whole reality. A bunch of us got together and decided to tell the owner of the shop that we thought it was haunted. We told her about the ghost always being seen walking through the same wall. We realized that there was an old newspaper article from the 1800s that was framed and hung as a picture on that wall. When we asked her about it, she said it was found plastered to the wall almost at the ceiling at the time of renovating the shop. The article was about a murder that was never solved. A bunch of my coworkers went to the archives to find out more information, but we never did find anything further out. This shop was very creepy, with a basement trapdoor that had been carpeted over, which was believed to be connected to underground tunnels in the city. A shop across the street was renovated and they found bloody clothes and a gun built into the wall. There are a lot of different stories in Chinatown. Based on my experiences, ghosts are real, but you have to be in the right mindset to be able to have an experience with one. Also, do not play with Ouija boards. I've had more than enough freaky encounters with those as well. I really believe they are contacting evil, and you do not want to bring that into your life. When I tried to get rid of my Ouija board, it kept reappearing in various places until I finally cut it up into a bunch of little pieces. 12. The following account is true. I've tried to keep it short but didn't want to skimp on detail. Something strange happened one night in first year at college when I went to a graveyard on my campus with a friend. It was a family plot, just a small huddle of gravestones roughly set in rows. But the fact that it was a graveyard at night just made it the perfect teenage thing to do. The fact that there was a tiny bit of ground mist made it a really creepy place to go that night. A few seconds after we ducked through a gap in the railings, my friend tapped me and Riley said, "Look over there." "What does that look like?" He pointed at what looked like a tall, dark area near the tree leaned. I thought it was just a combination of shadow, shade, and negative space through which you could look further into the woods, but I admitted that in ensemble it looked eerily like the outline of a very tall man standing very still by the edge of the dark cemetery. We walked among the gravestones for a few minutes, but there wasn't exactly a lot of territory to cover, and we soon realized that our time could be much better spent playing games back at the nice, warm halls, so we turned to leave. At that moment, I realized my cap was missing. Now, that was very unusual. I wore that thing all the time. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was a hair restraint while my hair was not quite long enough to tie back yet. I never took it off when active, but suddenly it was gone. My friend was also surprised. He said he'd obviously seen me arrive wearing it, and then when he looked at me when we were about to leave, noticed that it had gone. Perplexed, I wondered if it had been pulled off my head as we ducked through the railings. Nope. I retraced my footsteps, easy to do, because it wasn't a big place, and it wasn't anywhere. I had just turned to head back, figuring I would find it in the morning, when I heard my friend's alarmed cry. "Magic SPA? I found your hat." As soon as he said those words, I knew where he'd found it. I looked over and he was pointing at the base of the dark shadow/silhouette area, and there it was. It was night, but you could make out the definite hemisphere of my baseball cap laying on the ground, in a place neither of us had gone. In fact, I had to reach under and past a few small branches to scoop the thing off the ground. How it got there, I have no idea. My friend and I ducked under the railings again and sprinted out of that place. When I got back to the halls, there were splatter marks of mud about the whole back of our jeans and jacket where we'd shamelessly bolted along a muddy track back to safety. I have no idea how my cap ended up where it was that night, slightly into the undergrowth in that eerier shadow area that neither of us had gone near. Part of me is sure that CCTV footage would capture a perfectly rational explanation, and part of me believes that something in that graveyard thought I should have shown a little more respect. The library on that campus, not far from the graveyard, was also built on the previous site of an old manor house, and I've heard of sightings of a gray lady being made in it. I spent 4 years at that place and never had a spooky moment of any kind in the library, but that night in the graveyard remains one of the big mysteries of my life. 13. Allegedly the forest next to my house was typical rally spot for Satanists and the KKK, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, until urban development turned the once large forest to something short of a city park. So, we decided to go walking in the woods around witching hour with some flashlights. A lot of tripping and being spooked by quick escapes of some nocturnal creature no higher than our ankles. After what sounded like footsteps getting closer and closer behind us and the sound of wood smacking the trunks of nearby trees, I decided to lead the debate on getting out of there. After all, was it a ghost? A hobo? A demon? I don't know, and I didn't care. Also, this was a time when Angels vs. Demons and extraterrestrial contact type History Channel programs were circulating the television airwaves. So, we walked quickly back to the car, which was parked on the dirt road entrance that separated my neighborhood and the forest. As we got into the car and turned on the headlights, right in front of us was about a 100-pound mangy-looking dog with piercing eyes just staring at us. It turned and without losing eye contact slowly walked into the woods until it disappeared into the darkness. What's scary about this whole event was sometime prior I was watching History Channel about people finding angry-looking canine faces in photos even though there were no dogs, or anything present at the time of the photo. Religious experts explained that these were demons that haunted the people in the photos. Also, before we jumped into the car I would have thought the dog would have been visible. I don't know what it was, but I stopped ghost hunting that day. 14. My wife and I are amateur ghost hunters, and every time we travel we like to find at least one haunted location to do some paranormal activities. It's become a date night of sorts whenever we are on vacation. 2 years ago, we traveled to Greece for a couple of weeks. Prior to our trip, we researched several active spots and stumbled upon an interesting place called Davalos Cave. Funny enough, what intrigued us most about it was an obscure Reddit post about bizarre ghost tales surrounding the cave. Demonic hauntings, UFO sightings, government experiments, satanic cult activity, cryptos, electronics malfunctioning, time distortion, etc. There were even rumors of the military hiding nuclear weapons deep within its tunnels, like an episode of Dark. Suffice it to say, this place was like finding a ghost hunter's treasure chest. Literally, there was even a story about buried treasure there. The cave was believed to be centuries old and was used as a Greek temple of Pan at some point in history. Built into the cave was an abandoned monastery from the 1500s, also believed to be haunted. During our stay in Athens, we would casually ask locals about it whenever we had the chance. We had no luck the first few days. One night we had bar hopped to a random rooftop hostel, but we were the only ones there. We eventually began talking to the bartender, and by luck he was pretty knowledgeable of the site. He confirmed much of what we read about the place, visiting the cave himself a few years prior. He said it's a popular folktale in Athenian communities and most people are terrified of visiting. He thought we were crazy for wanting to go and was pretty adamant about how dangerous the journey itself was to get there, especially for tourists. It was a 2-hour hike up Pentile, and the trail was very steep and difficult to follow with only a few stones spray painted as directional markers. You can pin it on gaps, but even the bartender cautioned us that electronics tend to go haywire the closer you get to the cave itself. The bartender offered to write directions that would help us reach the town it resides in, and even drew us a crude map once we arrived at the start of the trail. My wife and I were no strangers to hiking, so that didn't bother us much. But he then proceeded to tell us that we should try to visit at night because the place was still rumored to host satanic rituals there. So, by that time we were pretty faded, and the rooftop started to fill up. After a few drunken convos, my wife and I revealed our plans to a few other travelers, and they were interested in joining us. Typically, my wife and I don't include anyone else in these excursions, but with the nature and uncertainty of this spot we thought it might be smart to have a few bodies with us in case it actually decided to turn into a horror film. About 6 people agreed to tag along, but by morning, when most of them sobered up, only 3 actually showed up to meet us. After a few metro trains and bus rides we arrived in the town. The town itself was a bit eerie in itself. Locals could tell very quickly we were tourists and gave us very uninviting stares. My wife knew we were close to the trail, but we still didn't know exactly where it was. So, she decided to walk into a restaurant diner and asked for additional directions. When she came back she told us that the person she spoke with advised her that we should turn back and it's not a typical place for tourists. My wife said the interaction was a bit hostile and spooked her. Instead of heeding the warning, it actually fueled us even more to go. We finally found the trail and started walking with plenty of daylight to spare. About 20 to 30 minutes into the trail we used 2 different Google Maps to try and follow the pinned location of the cave. Suddenly, just as others mentioned, both apps began spiraling and recalculating, putting us in a wrong direction for several minutes. One of the walking paths it sent us on had us walking past very oddly placed building ruins. We all then heard voices and a faint scream in the near distance. We all agreed to continue on despite it has startled us. Once we got on the right path, the trail itself became very narrow and inclined. There were mineral mines all over and one slip of a rock and you're dropping to your death. Thankfully, we realized after a couple of hours we were close to the location. Once we arrived we noticed 2 dogs with no owner present. Before we explored the cave we took a pit stop to the monastery. Easily one of the darkest places I've ever walked in. There were altars all around and very bizarre occult depictions of Christian saints. My wife and I took out our eyes, we came prepared, and started to ask a few questions. My wife's Eve at one point described her appearance from what she was wearing, even mentioning her nose ring. Probably some of the best ever evidence we have since we started this hobby of ours. My wife then felt like she couldn't breathe and had to walk outside. I stayed in. I began to ask my own questions while taking multiple pictures and videos. At one moment I felt the coldest temperature spike I had ever experienced, and then suddenly I felt a grip on my shoulders as if someone were massaging me. I didn't immediately move because I kind of froze up. The sensation got too intense, and I also had to leave. When I looked back at the footage it was riddled with orbs, and I even have video of the altar covering slightly moving on its own. Certainly, freaked me out. The cave itself was even crazier. The moment you approached the cave, you could immediately feel the energy radiating off this thing. No kidding, it felt like you were stepping into a generator. One of the travelers with us was a photographer, so she started taking pictures of me from behind exiting the cave. When I looked at the photos I became visibly shaken because the pics seemed to capture a ghostly apparition literally following me out of the cave, but almost as if it were right on my back, and all I could remember was the sensation I felt in the church was in the exact same spot. My wife then pulls out her Eve again, and all that was repeated was 3 words: cave, ancient, spirit. Whatever it was, it did not feel friendly. We noticed sundown was approaching, so decided to head out. On our way back down the trail we continued to hear faint screams louder than the last. No clue as to where it was coming from. The negative vibes from that cave stuck with me for a few weeks even after I returned home. 15. Any experience with the paranormal can be frightening. Something you know should not exist suddenly revealing itself sends more than just shivers down your spine. However, the scariest experience I had was with a balloon. Some people use diverse ways to connect with ghosts, and I decided to use a balloon. I figured it would attract at least one spirit to take a peek. Who doesn't like balloons after all? I'm sitting on a bed, scrolling through my phone, completely forgetting about the balloon. Side note, I had chosen a room with no windows or air conditioning so that the balloon wouldn't move. That just so happened to be a bedroom. Incredibly lucky for my lazy self. All of a sudden I heard a small bop from beside me. It was faint, but close, so I turned my head. I come face to face with a string. I stare at it for a second before I realize what it is. I look up and, lo and behold, there's the balloon. Remember, extraordinarily little air movement in the room, only really being formed my movements, of which there were none. I feel that little bit of fear that comes with the paranormal, but stomp it down. What is the spirit going to do? Bank me with a balloon? I get up and start trying to communicate with it, just to see if it really is a spirit. Move the balloon to the right if you're here with me, please. The balloon moves to the right. Move the balloon to the left if you have something to communicate. The balloon moves to the left. At this point, I'm all on my own, with a very pronounced spirit with something to say. I can feel my heart pounding, but rein it in. We still don't know what kind of spirit this is. I ask the second most important question in ghost hunting: do you want to hurt me? Move the balloon to the left if you do and to the right if you don't. The balloon, in all its slow drifting glory, moves to the left. I just about scared myself at once but went to get confirmation. Move the balloon to the right if you want to hurt me. It moves to the right. I book it out of there and take the balloon with me. If this spirit is attached to it, then it's got to go. I walk outside, hold the balloon out, and let that baby fly. That thing made it to the stratosphere from what I could tell and was gone. Hope that spirit went with it because I do not tolerate that kind of negative energy in my life. Haven't used balloons for investigations since. 16. I commented yesterday in another thread about some paranormal experiences I had living in an enormous mansion with a reputation for being haunted. I'm not an investigator, but this house was a hotspot for ghost hunters. The scariest experience though was on the first Saturday of July in 2008. It was either the day before or after the 4th of July, I can't remember which. This house was open to the public and we had a large tour group for the last tour of the day. Among the visitors was a large group of children and their chaperone. We ended our tour in the vast ballroom on the second floor and I was watching the group while the owner was conducting the last segment of the tour. I noticed the chaperone of the children slipping out of a door and I went to follow him. He turned and went down to the long gallery which ran parallel to the length of the ballroom. I caught up with him halfway down in front of a closed set of doors, which was another one of the entrances into the ballroom. It had 5. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he had an EMF detector and he waved it in front of the doors and the lights were going off like crazy. I asked him to join the group for the remainder of the tour and not wander off. After the tour ended, we closed up the house. The owner often liked to play the pipe organ which was on the 3rd floor. It had a balcony overlooking the ballroom from one of the narrower ends. The ballroom was double height and the upper part rose into the 3rd floor space, and an orchestral gallery along the upper side of one of the long ends of the ballroom. While she was playing I was wandering around and walked down to the end of the orchestral gallery to a door which led to a hall off of which were my apartments. When I touched the handle of the door I heard an unfamiliar voice call my name. It sounded both neat and far at the same time. I went back to the organ loft and asked the owner if she had called for me. She said no, but that she thought she had heard something down in the ballroom. I went downstairs and walked down to the gallery where the air felt thick and electric to the set of doors in the middle. I opened them and felt a huge whoosh of the same hot, staticky air. It was like a constant wind despite the windows and doors being closed. I called up the owner and said something strange was going on. She came down and through the gallery to the ballroom, waving her hands as if she were pushing the air around, remarking that it felt thick. She entered the ballroom and looked across to the stained glass windows lining the other long side of the ballroom. She told me there was something there which didn't belong in the house. She closed her eyes and said, "Show me your face," and then jumped back. She said she had seen the face of something evil. Then, she closed her eyes again and pushed her arms forcefully forward while saying, "Get out of my house." I watched a woman in her late 60s leaning forward with her hands pushed against something I couldn't see at a 45 degrees angle. Suddenly, I heard a cracking sound and she fell forward as another audible whoosh of air came through the room through the gallery doors. She said whatever it was gone. That evening, however, we dined in the library, and you could hear knocking, scratching, laughing, footsteps, etc., echoing throughout the building until about midnight. 17. Not a ghost hunter but grew up in a haunted house and later lived in a different haunted house for a few years. House 1, lived in from age 12 to 18. 2 different entities inhabited the house. It was nearly 100 years old and had multiple additions. The most active part of the house was a room we called the den. This entity was fairly benign and most just slammed doors and messed with the TV by switching the channels, normally to some children's shows. If you yelled at it to stop messing with the TV it would stop, but then shortly after would open and close one of the doors in the room. There were two. And yes, I mean full on twist the knob, open the door several feet and then fully shut the door. Once it got really angry at my brother and slammed the door so hard a picture felt bizarre and broke. Only time it ever really got violent or scary. Was normally only active during the day and early evening and only in the den or office part of the house. Scary entity in house 1 only came out at night and was terrifying. Was active in all parts of the house but particularly the basement and second floor bedrooms. When we first moved into the house we had our dogs crated in the basement. They hated it. They would randomly start barking and snarling like crazy in the random hours of the morning. After a few months of no sleep, we moved their crates upstairs. After that day neither dog would ever go in the basement and would randomly stand at the top of the basement stairs and bark like maniacs. The cats refused to go in the basement either. We would go in the basement to do laundry and it would randomly be pulled out of the washer or drying and strewn around the basement. After my mom interrogated everyone in the family we realized no one was doing this but we were all finding it in this manner. Boxes and whatnot stacked in the basement were routinely moved, knocked over, and contents strewn about the basement. I would also occasionally wake up in the middle of the night and watch as my bedroom door opened but no one would come in. My cat would often then sit on my chest and hiss/swat at the doorway. In another instance I got up to use the restroom in the middle of the night and the upstairs bathroom door was closed, so thinking my brother was using it I went downstairs and used the one that had been created out of an old closet, no windows. I used the restroom and as I finished and went to wash my hands the light went off. I tried to turn it back on, but it was like the bulb burnt out. I went to open the door and it wouldn't open. It felt like someone was holding onto the door handle on the other side. I thought it was my brother and started telling him off, but he didn't answer. I started to panic and bang on the door screaming to be let out. After a few minutes, my dad came downstairs and couldn't get the door open at first either. He finally opened the door and as soon as he did the light came back on. We never found out how it all happened, but when we went back upstairs my brother was in his room and had no clue what had been going on. House 2, previous owner, and her husband died peacefully in the home. Fairly sure the woman who died is still around the house. We completely renovated it when we moved into the house. First few years living there we randomly heard footsteps on the hardwood floors when no one else was home or no one else was around. TVs turn themselves on and off all the time, particularly at moments when you don't want them on or off, middle of a show or middle of dinner. The rocking chair in front hallway will randomly start rocking while you're watching it and no one else is anywhere around it. You will be standing in a room and hear someone talking very muffled and turn around and realize no one else is home. Dogs will go crazy and start barking in the back room and the alcove, that we later found out was where the woman had her hospital bed towards the end of her life and eventually died. About a year after we moved in my dad was walking up the stairs one day with a basket of laundry and he heard an old woman very clearly say, "Get out of my house." He dropped the basket on the landing and said no problem, grabbed his keys and left until my mom got off work. Parents have lived there for about 10 years now and they say the old woman is much less active than she used to be. 18. I'm not a professional but I've dabbled in ghost hunting before. About 6 to 7 years ago me and a group of friends were amateur ghost hunters. We didn't give all the gear that modern ghost hunters had but we gathered the basics. We only had one spirit box that we swapped around in shifts. Our team had decided to spend the night in our state forest which was said to be haunted. There used to be Native American grounds there long ago. Everything went smoothly and we set up and made sure we had our bug spray as it was midsummer. Early on we didn't get much. Small little lights on our camera that could just as easily be specks of dust or dirt. Small sounds that could just as easily be animals stepping on sticks. It picked up around midnight. I was on shift at home camp communicating with the others. It started smoothly, but I lost contact with one of our groups, the one we sent with the spirit box. I remember being unnerved by this. I contacted everyone else about her, but no one had any knowledge of where she was or where she went. We were all severely worried, not because of ghosts necessarily, but because it was a big forest, and it was easy to get lost. We decided to group up once more this time to search for her. Since I knew the forest the most, I took the lead. We didn't find her for an hour afterward, during which many of our group said they were hearing some kind of voice. When we found our friend, she seemed to be shaking. She told us how she kept trying the walkie-talkie to no avail. We checked later, and the batteries weren't dead. She also told us how after she couldn't reach us, she tried the spirit box. Most of this is her own interpretation. I don't know what she asked or what it said exactly, so bear that in mind. She said that there seemed to be multiple presences. One kept telling her to run, to leave the forest. The others seemed to want to kill her. The other told her she was trespassing, that they would kill us. After that, we decided to head home and stop for the day. I'm not sure if she was telling the whole truth or whether she was making it up, but it was a very creepy experience regardless. 19. Not a ghost hunter, but have had some eerie things happen to me. I used to live in this house a few years ago, which had some weird things going on. I was an atheist before I moved there. It was a 2-story house, with 2 rooms per story. 1 kitchen, 2 bathrooms. It had a terrace too, which I would frequent for a smoke or two. I remember the first time I entered the house. It felt weird. The air was heavy, and the smell was as if it had not opened for years. It was cheap and I was not doing well financially, so I didn't even think of moving out. The first night, nothing happened. Slept well. It was from the second night or so, things got weird. Midnight, went up to the terrace for a smoke. Lit the cigarette up and looked into the distance. There were 3 huge orbs flying around from 3 meters from me at eye level. I finished my cigarette and stood looking at them. Didn't feel creeped out at all. Dismissed the event as a product of fatigue. The next week was pretty uneventful, although there were some items that went missing on their own and were found in unlikely places. By the 3rd week or so, the flying orbs could also be seen in my room at night. There are also some creepy things happening, like misplaced objects, taps running off on their own, TVs, computers turning on their own. Didn't feel threatened at all. Decided to stay in that house for over a year. Moved out because my financial condition improved. It did get a little annoying at times though. Friends would stay out of that house, except some ballsy ones. That house turned a lot of atheists into crumpled masses of terrified believers. Good times. 20. I got into urban exploration a few years ago. Very cool, but comes with tons of risks, but what doesn't? Anyways, a friend and I decided to explore this old orphanage. It was exceedingly small and on private land. We had to trespass on someone's land. A neighbor actually allowed us to go up because she was family of the owner, and hike up a massive hill to get there. We get there and it's 3 stories of pure creepiness. Nothing scares me, and the same goes for the friend I was with. My friend is overly sensitive to stuff and pretty much told me, I don't feel right, something is here, and it doesn't want us here. We were on the 2nd floor of this building, and we were almost finished going up to the 3rd floor. We started heading towards the stairs and a massive gust of wind blew the door shut and we heard a loud crash up above and suddenly a bed fell through the ceiling, only partially, but we got out of there quick. When we got down to the car, we rationalized that it was more than likely old flooring and heavy wind, but we didn't want to take our chances. 21. My time in Fairfield Hills Mental Asylum. It was on the MTV show Fear and in a few movies. Supposedly haunted, but definitely had lobotomies and other barbaric tests done on patients. We planned to spend the night there. This was 2002, I had a friend who managed to go in multiple times, and he took the lead. We Metal Gear style snuck our way across the massive campus to the rehab building by the side of the woods. There a window was smashed out into the basement. We slid in and explored all night. The thing about Fairfield Hills was they had these long tunnels that connected to each facility. They were probably 12 by 12 feet and so long and so dark your flashlight illumination would swallow up into the void of darkness. After exploring every building we could and avoiding the obvious tunnels with asbestosis, we turned in for the night. I have a tough time falling asleep. It's 2 a.m. as I am writing this, when I hear footsteps. It's not uncommon for security to go into the buildings as they know people like me, and my company like to explore the property. The footsteps are getting louder and I wake everyone up. We lay quiet as the footsteps are now on our floor walking towards us. My heart is racing, but then I hear a teenage girl's voice and realize they are here for the same thing. I decided I'm going to mess with them and tap my flashlight button as it's pointed out that small window that doctors peer through to look at a patient. They see it and begin to panic. I jump to my feet and roar like a beast and watch them all scatter. I can't keep the act up and apologize for messing with them. I give them a guided tour since I can't sleep while my friends sleep in the room we picked. After walking them to the window to exit I head back to the room to go to sleep. No more than 10 minutes later I hear more footsteps, but this time I hear doors opening and closing. This time it sounds like someone is patrolling the halls. At first it would be a few floors below us. Then 10 minutes later it was above us. Then it would be silent for 15 to 20 minutes, then it would be somewhere else in the building. I consider myself a brave person. I walked the length and many floors of that building alone that night with no fear. Whatever was patrolling the halls that night I didn't want to meet. 22. Not an official ghost hunter or anything, just like urban exploring. Also heads up, it's a long one. There's an old-ass hidden building called the Asylum in my hometown. OFC, it has this cheesy used to be an asylum in the 1920s and closed due to malpractice blah blah, but it was actually a cattle exchange in the 50s, a venue in the 70s and a haunted house in the early 2000s. The haunted house shut down because people kept getting hurt in the building. Well, I found it. It's a pretty stable / intact building and had gone a couple of times since, but there was only one room that gave me the hereby jibes. It was at the far end of where you'd have to climb up a second-story window to get in, go all the way down the hall. It's painted all black, a cliché detailed pentagram of some sort drawn in red on the wall. When I would go it'd be around 4 a.m. to avoid running into any police tongue sticking out, so it was dark, and I usually just used a flashlight or my phone light to see. At first my light would only cut out if you were directly in the black room and turn back in once I walked a few feet outside. I wanted to see if it was a phone glitch or low battery or something, so I tested it out a few more times. A fully charged phone, an industrial flashlight, a lighter and a regular flashlight. The same thing happened every time. Lights cut out, run out, and it'd turn back on. However, the more I did this, the farther away from the room I'd be when the lights were cut off and they wouldn't turn back on until I jumped out the window. Haven't gone in years but still have no explanation for it. 23. I have a fairly delightful story. So, this vehicle that has spikes and designs on it saying paranormal here something drives around my town. I met the guy one day and talk him up. I ended up getting to be a part of his team, which was him and his mom, but he made it seem like it was a big team, and they had a headquarters. We go to this house with about 50 rooms in a 2-story house with a basement. We set up, everything seems okay. Until the main guy tells one of his crew members to leave because he wanted to use to house Wi-Fi. Then later when we went into the attic, while in separate areas of the attic a piece of drywall got thrown at me, and at first I didn't really react, but when I made a comment they all started acting nuts and telling us to get out. So, after the investigation he told me he uploaded everything we filmed to YouTube. Looking back through the film you can clearly see the guy throw the drywall at me and pretend it wasn't. That's all I got, never went back. YouTube was like paranormal headquarters with 30 to 2-minute clips. 24. Let's begin. Oh boy lol, it was around Halloween ironically, and me and my mother were eating a life-sized gummy, shaped like a chopped-off hand, when all of a sudden she froze and grabbed me. She started screaming bloody murder looking into the center of the living room. She called the police and she said, "The son of Sam. Please help. The son of Sam." From what I could tell, it looked like the operator thought she was crazy, then she grabbed my face, and faced it to the center of the room. All she kept saying was, "Can you see? Can you see it? Speak. Talk." I couldn't speak, I was just too scared. I must have been at least 5, and a woman screaming and shaking me didn't help. She went on to tell the operator that I was possessed, and he had me. Everything after that is a blur, but I'm not sure if it was my kid's brain, or extreme anxiety, but I have a memory of the words "Son of Sam" floating in the middle of the room like it's made of smoke. I also have memories of a masculine voice whispering at night, "Come to the window, kid." I'm not sure, again the mind of a child is an imaginative one. But a year back I got curious and looked up what the son of Sam was. Turns out it was a serial killer from the 80s or something. Pardon the story being all over. 25. So, this was an exorcism that was so bad, I actually gave it a pass, but someone I knew ended up picking it up for some brownie points in his organization. So, the general premise was this: a guy we both knew had been seeing this girl for about a week and he kept complaining every time they would have intercourse. He would wake up the next morning vomiting, bleeding, and he would start mistreating people around him. This was the stage at which I dipped. I don't need to mess with horrors of the other side because the WAP game is good. So, the other guy took it. He and another person who thought they could help went to the apartment of the girl. Now my acquaintance is actually not too bad in spiritual matters, so the moment he showed up, he knew something was drastically wrong when he noticed blood begin to pool in his mouth when the girl showed up at the door. He opted to wait outside telling the other person, "Oh, this girl just needs some affirmation and love for a while, so do your best." I only have a little bit of the story from the inside. The girl apparently started bleeding from the eyes and screaming while books fell off the shelves and glass started breaking. Eventually, the person who was inside finished and went home. The next day he admitted himself to a mental hospital after screaming and thrashing all the previous night and bleeding from his eyes. The fellow who stayed at the door got full credit for the exorcism and was profusely thanked, though the guy seeing the girl stopped seeing her because in that time he'd found a new squeeze. That's the scariest one, but I've got lots of exorcism stories.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.